wonder foreign leaders believe they can walk all over him. They see him as a weak, incompetent leader who does not even have the support of his own party.
We've got our sleeves rolled up. We are fighting for Canadians every single day. We will stand up for good Canadian jobs. We will make sure we continue to have great relations with the United States as we build a stronger future on both sides of the border.
Politicians on Parliament Hill appear united on one thing this week. Donald Trump's threat to impose 25% tariffs on Canadian imports is a big problem. They're less united, however, on what to do about it. As we speak, however, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is seeking unity from Canada's premiers, convening a virtual First Ministers meeting. Here's what some of those premiers had to say ahead of the call.
We have to take the threat seriously from President Trump. When he says we need to tighten up the border, we need to tighten up the border. The federal government needs to have a plan. We don't need a plan a month down the road. We need a plan now.
I do think we have a strong case to make that those tariffs are badly placed if the priority for President Trump is to reduce the cost for Americans. And we're ready to make that case.
We're unified, but we also need to make sure that we are using our personal relationships, our professional relationships across the borders to make sure that it's not just the president and his administration, but the citizens understand the implications.
Let's bring back the front bench to talk about that. Sabrina Grover, Jamie Ellerton, Carl Bélanger, and Rika Walsh are all here. Sabrina, I'll start with you. Do you think they're going to emerge from this meeting taking place right now united in the way that some of the premiers talked about and that the Prime Minister talks about?
I think they're certainly going to have a united a united message on what needs to be done. And I think that that's important. I think that if the premiers are smart and the federal government is smart, that they would come across with one or two key messages that they're going to take to the United States. But I don't think that that's going to be the only message that the premiers have, right? I think it's important for the premiers to have different negotiating stakes. They all have individual relationships. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think what's strong about Team Canada is that we are coming together, that we took this emergency step right away for this meeting, that a couple of weeks ago we convened the Canada-US Cabinet Commission. I think that these are all important steps. At the end of the day, Donald Trump is going to make this into a media circus. He wants us to be Fox News sound bites. He wants us to be snippets on X, right? And I don't think that that's the approach that we should take. We want to be the adults in the room. We want to be negotiating with this from a diplomatic standpoint. And part of that means convening with the premiers, but it also means convening with like business councils and business organizations.
Jamie, the politics of it, though, are interesting, right? And I think you've already seen some speculation that it could lead to, does the oil sector get pitted against supply management? Is there going to actually be the kind of unity that existed, let's say, back in 2016, given the very different political context that exists today? Oh, you might be on mute. Sorry, my apologies.
Sorry about that, Vassy. I was indeed on mute. My apologies for that. I don't think you're going to see that unity. I think you're going to see some different messages that everyone's going to try and see. I think right now you're hearing from pretty much every premier and the Prime Minister speaking more to process and effort rather than on impact or anything tangible as to what's going to happen. But I think ultimately voters are going to judge elected leaders on whether or not they were able to get something done. I think when you look at what the President Trump's administration is saying, that kind of 25 blanket tariff across the board. Of course, some people think that there's going to be some carve-outs in industries that are exempt from that. But if you get into a kind of tit-for-tat retaliatory race, I don't think anyone thinks that Canada can win that kind of fight. And of course, let's not forget, tariffs are taxes. So if they're going to put retaliatory tariffs here in Canada, that means Canadians are going to be paying even more. And this is coming after inflation and affordability has been the biggest issue of our time for the past 2 years. So the politics of this are going to be fraught. I think the fact they're all talking about process shows none of them really know what the path forward is. And this kind of Team Canada, call every no in Washington approach seems to be like grasping at straws this time.
What do you think? What's your sense, Carl, of what the Prime Minister might need to do to incentivize the kind of unity that he wants to see? Certainly, we heard from premiers in the lead up to this call. They're looking for specifics around a plan of attack, not just we did this once, we can do it again.
Yeah, and Prime Minister is in a tight spot because he has in front of him a leader of the opposition that is seen by most Canadians as better equipped to deal with Trump. So the challenge for Prime Minister Trudeau is to keep that front united. It's going to be very difficult. I mean, Premier Ford talking about borders, Premier Legault certainly all in about borders. They're saying Trump is right. And they're basically saying that we got to get our act together. That's not a really very united message. So we'll see if they tone that down in coming days. But Prime Minister Trudeau, he's doing what he has to do, considering the reaction that we're getting in the country. And this is where Donald Trump's brilliancy comes into play. And, it's the same pattern. We've seen it before. It's in this book, Art of the Deal. That's how he does it. You announce something outrageous, you announce it publicly, you let everybody panic and, react. And then, you have the upper end in the negotiation because everybody's so afraid. And it's working again.
Here's the thing I don't know yet, though. What exactly does he want? Like, obviously, it's about the border, Marika. But, so far from cabinet ministers, and we heard it tonight from Minister Anand, the border is fortified. Despite some of the data that's raising concern, and it is relative to Mexico, not a huge amount, but it's still something, and it's an increase. She made a point of saying it's not new. We've been sending resources to the border for a long time. So, what do you think Trump really wants at the border, and do the feds even know?
I don't think they do, and I don't think the argument for Trump is, we've already been dealing with this, because the numbers have been increasing. So that's not a winning argument. I think that Donald Trump wants to be able to be inaugurated in January with a win that he can point to. And so the government, the faster it can figure out what that win is for the U.S. president, the faster they might be out of the corner they're in. I think if you look at the premiers and you look at just the trajectory over the last 3 weeks, Doug Ford in particular has made a point of trying to get out ahead of the federal government. He has done that in saying what should happen with the trade negotiations that aren't even up for review until 2026. And now he's doing that with things like this ad campaign that his government had already planned before the election, had already scheduled to go out next week, according to reporting from our colleagues at Queen's Park. And so I think that makes it even more difficult for Trudeau to look like he is on top of it. This meeting happened because the premiers asked for it last week, not because it was the PMO's idea.
What do you think, Sabrina, the Prime Minister and the people around him need to convey to get everyone on the same page? Like to not have Doug Ford out in front of everything and for it to be them? Or maybe this is part of the approach that they think might work. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the premiers, like Danielle Smith, are calling for a little bit more hysteria by the Prime Minister, and I really just don't think that's the right approach. I think that's the approach you're going to see from the United States, and we have to be calm, steady, rational, and diplomatic. I think that I don't hate that the premiers are going and having having a message of their own, right? I think the Doug Ford campaign is actually interesting. It's smart. It talks directly to the U.S. consumer. This isn't just a tariff that's going to be bad for Canada. It's going to be obviously monumentally bad, but it's also going to raise prices, and it's also going to be very, very bad for the American consumer. And I think that the more that we can get that message across, and I harken back to my last point, this idea that we need to get business councils and businesses on our side as well, not just in Canada, but also in the United States, is really, really important. And I think it's interesting that people see that Pierre Poilievre is maybe the better position to be the negotiator. But at the end of the day, he's the least likely to be on Team Canada. He spent the last 12 months lambasting business councils, lambasting premiers he doesn't like. So I don't think that he's really bringing a Team Canada approach. Now he's lambasting the Prime Minister. I think if the best thing that we can do is remain calm, diplomatic, rational, and really make the message hone in that this is bad for everyone.
Sabrina flags an interesting dynamic going forward, Jamie, right? And it's going to be this pushback from the Liberals around criticism on this file, in particular coming from the Conservatives, framing it as something that will weaken the overall, negotiating position of Canada. I think there are Canadians who subscribe to that, and I think there are Canadians who don't. What do you think of that?
I think the Liberal negotiating position is the fact that they don't really know what's going to happen, and they're kind of relying, when you hear Minister Champagne talk about redoing what they did last time. I think when you actually look at the realities, like Vassy, on your show last week, we actually talked in rather really explicit detail of how this government has lost control of the immigration system. And we know there are over 1 million people here right now who are on temporary status, whose status is about to expire. And I think Chris Selly had the tweet on X today that would essentially account for like 15% of daily airport traffic at our airports if they all actually left like they're supposed to. And no one actually believes that is going to happen. So where are they going to go? Potentially the U.S. border. And so I think this threat is far bigger than kind of any of the talking point kind of jockeying you're seeing right now. I think when you look at what Premier Ford is doing, of course, let's keep in mind that he's quite explicit in hinting that he's going to go to an early election and he's going to drape himself in a Canadian flag and be like Captain Canada as Premier of Ontario. And I think this U.S. ad campaign is actually more designed to reinforce that Ontario talking point than having any kind of grand delusions that it's going to sway the minds of Americans to somehow get President Trump to change it. So I think the kind of practical realities to what's going on here, you have a government that's very long in the tooth, wildly unpopular with Canadians, and has the albatross of the status quo around its neck saying that they're somehow going to be the agent of change. Contrast that with, of course, where the Conservatives are going. And I think some of the generational, bigger picture things that needs to happen. One of the things that kind of came to mind listening to Sabrina, I know talking with business councils, chambers, and et cetera, that's kind of a tired playbook. Pierre Poilievre's, quite frankly, been quite provocative in saying, stop talking to these people and the lobbyists who have kind of built the status quo. You need to actually help real working people. And what are you going to do that? And I think part of the challenge for businesses in these organizations is to recognize that the world has changed and that some things are going to have to change. And so how do you actually constructively win popular support amongst Canadians for what you're trying to do, as opposed to playing phone tag in Ottawa?
Yeah, I think just 30 seconds left, Marika. I think that can be true. And at the same time, there be a real success story in the outreach of business communities to their American counterparts in the first iteration of Trump. That's not to say for sure it applies this time, but it was a successful part of the story. I remember interviewing people at the Detroit Chamber of Commerce, and like they were all in on trying to pressure Trump to realize how much this would impact the U.S. economy.
Yeah, and it's clear that education campaign through ads or whatever means is still needed. You know, you watch the American coverage of this tariff threat when it first came earlier this week, and some of the TV reports didn't even mention how much oil goes into the U.S. that the U.S. uses. So to think that this argument is already over, that the Americans know, I think would be a mistake.
Okay, I got to leave it there. Guys, thanks for such a great discussion. I appreciate it. Our front bench, Sabrina Grover, Jamie Allerton, Carl Belanger, and Marika Walsh. After a quick break here on Power Play, is the Fed's proposed GST holiday break and $250 rebate checks good fiscal policy? I'm going to put that question to former Bank of Canada Governor David Dodge after a short break.